So, good afternoon. Clearly, thrillers are a thing, and there are so many of you on this afternoon here to listen to two writers of thrillers, and I'm sure readers of thrillers, talk about the thrill of thriller writing. So, let me start by asking all of you in general, who doesn't like a thriller? I'm sure, I don't think there's anyone who will say, I don't like a thriller, right? Reading is about thrill, right? The thrill of reading a thriller is something else, right? The thrill of reading a thriller, what happens is we leave aside our work, we put aside our sleep just to finish the thriller, right? And these are people who write thrillers, right? They want you to lose your sleep, right? They want you not to do your work so that you can read, their books and other thrilling books. So what I'm going to try and do in the next 45 minutes or so is to try and ask them, how they do that, what are they thinking, what do they have to do, what do they have to read, etc., right? So the most obvious first question, I'll start with you, Vivaan, right? I'm sure you love thrillers. When did you first realize that the thriller was the thing that you really liked reading?
Yeah. So I think when I discovered Edgar Allan Poe, I think after discovering Poe, I certainly figured that the medium of prose itself is perhaps the art form that's best suited to the construction of suspense. Different art forms go about that in different ways. The comic book would do it in a certain way, theatre would do it in a certain way, and film would do it in a certain way. But I think what is specific to the medium of words, of prose, is that one can, with the arrangement, in the same way that one creates a sort of poetic effect with a combination and arrangement of words, one can at the same time create a suspenseful effect with the combination and arrangement of words. And that's what Poe actually exemplified best for me, because his sentence construction style was very, for lack of a better word, baroque. The opposite of what we're used to today with a lot of literary minimalism. He used to screech in the opposite direction. He would practice what they call circumlocution, right? Which is saying as little in as many words as possible, which is the opposite of the opposite of the pre-say format, that the thing that has been ingrained in us. So it was very interesting how, with this tantalizing kind of circumlocution and this very convoluted sentence style, he would create suspense in a very interesting manner.
He ran circles in your head and you didn't mind that.
Absolutely. That's the crazy part about it, is that how he did that. And that's I think what essentially got me really interested in the genre of suspense and the thriller and crime fiction in general.
Right. What about you, Nilanjana? When did you discover that thriller was the thing for you? Or one of the things for you. I'm not saying it's the only thing.
Well, first, it's really great to be out here with Vivaan. We were talking backstage about how the love for this genre, which is vast. It takes in noir fiction on one side, pulp on the other hand. It's the least snobbish genre, one of the least snobbish genres, and that's one of the reasons why I like it. But at the start, when I was writing Black River, I didn't know I was writing a thriller. My attitude to it was, I'm following these people around. One of them has had a terrible, terrible loss. And in the aftermath of a murder, the ripples that go out into a small community, a small village, fictional village of Titarpur near New Delhi, what happens to everybody involved? This entire question of what is justice and how is it supposed to be delivered was a big thing. When I discovered that I was actually writing a thriller, it was or noir fiction, it was terrifying, because that's a genre that I've loved with all my heart. I remember reading Surendra Mohan Pathak, we were talking about that, and I went to a very austere Sahitya Academy literary event where somebody sneered at Hindi writers like this pulp guy, Surendra Mohan Pathak. And I said, I must immediately get into this. I read my first Pathak, slim, pacey, makes your blood race, and great characters, and I was completely hooked. I was also teaching myself Hindi at that time. And I'd come to the thriller, not the thriller precisely, but detective fiction, through the Bengali detective Byomkesh Bakshi, who I was in awe of, not because he's eaten a lot of fish and his brain cells are great and he solves murders in, turn of independence, Calcutta, but because he runs after suspects in a full Bengali dhoti with the pleats, and I don't know how you do that. I can climb a tree in my sari, but I can't run after suspects in it. And the third thing was when I read Miss Milla's Feeling for Snow. It was a massive bestseller some 20, 30 years ago. And I think that was the book that made me realize you could go into darkness, real human darkness, evil, uh, people who do terrible things and sometimes have no remorse for it. And you could care about everybody on the page. And I'm often told that I'm writing literary fiction with Black River, and I say yes, yes. And then somebody comes along and says, you're writing noir fiction, and I say yes, yes. Because, my feeling is that the thriller, and the reason why we love it so much is because it contains all of this. And that's what it makes it so challenging as a writer. Can you write a book that people can literally read in 3 hours? But can they also come back to it and then go through it more slowly and have fun?
No, I meant to ask you this later, but I'll ask you this now since you brought it up. Of course, a thriller is a thriller, right? It gets your blood racing, your pulse racing, and all of that. But what I noticed in both your books when I was reading it is there, of course, thrillers and murder mysteries, but you're also talking about deeper things, right? You're providing us a glimpse into that society, and it's not a pretty sight. So the thriller can be used, for other purposes apart from, making us neglect our work and sleep and all of that. You can actually talk about serious things through a thriller. Would you agree? What do you think?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think a lot of the great, like for instance, we were talking about this novelist by the name of Jim Thompson, who is this really hard-boiled, mean, hard-edged kind of novels he used to write. And he was known as dime store Dostoevsky because his books were truly, they were like pathological studies. They were studies of very unstable protagonists, often psychopathic, and often psychopathic under the guise of the law. Like he'd have these sheriffs who were his protagonists, but behind that sort of veneer of being a sort of upholder of the law lay perhaps a psychopath or a serial killer. Even James M. Cain did that. He explored the possibility that the wandering door-to-door salesman, the vacuum cleaner salesman, could be a murderer. That possibility had not been explored prior to a certain school of crime fiction, which was, you could call them slightly more esoteric. They had, as you said, they had slightly more different agendas than a James Hadley Chase. Like they were trying to plumb, although even James Hadley Chase in certain novels did explore certain darker areas. But especially the 50s, the pulp writers, they used to explore the human psyche and also also society in general. They would really, really plumb the underbelly of society and of what urban living entails. I think that's another important component of crime fiction, is that the urban landscape becomes almost like a sort of gothic castle for the characters to wander through, and that becomes a sort of. So it's a very interesting. I think every city has its own relationship with the crime genre, right? Delhi, Bombay, or in America, Chandler's Los Angeles, as opposed to Elmore Leonard's Detroit or something like that. And Surendra Mohan Pathak's UP, let's not forget that, where he'd have titles like 65 lakh ki daketi.
So the charm of reading a thriller, of course, is something else. But tell us a little bit about the struggles of writing a thriller. It can't be easy, I would imagine. So how do you begin that process? What do you do, and so on?
I don't think it's a struggle so much as it's such a joy. By the way, if you're standing at the back in the sun, there's seats in the front, so just come and occupy them, No, don't be shy. Okay.
We won't be offended if you leave.
At this point, one of my friends told me that the best way to write a thriller was to abandon my reviewer, editor hat or my reader hat and just pick up something like an Agatha Christie, take it apart chapter by chapter and take a look at the clockwork, the mechanical stuff behind it. And I did that and I was kind of blown away, because when you look at it from that perspective, you see how somebody's introducing characters and you see that time is one of the biggest things. Handling time is tricky for any thriller writer. So I leaned on the best because I knew that I was a novice to this. And ultimately I went back to my journalism roots. Everything in Black River is fictional. It's based on real policemen I've met. Ombir and Bhimsen were based on these rural policemen who were not yet corrupted. They were corruptible, but they had retained some sense of decency. Even though, there were cynics at a very young age, which is what being a policeman in Delhi, Haryana, and Uttar Pradesh will do to you. And I just told myself, write it as though it's real. Imagine the whole thing. But then write about Khalid, Rabia, and Chand, who are the three migrants who come to the Black River, the Yamuna, originally in the 1990s, and write about them as though they're real and write in friendship, even with the villains. And if you can do that, then you're writing down something, you've imagined it completely. And it's as vivid in your mind as the palace out here. And then you're just writing, reporting, really. So I went back to that.
What about you, Vivaan? When you were writing, what was happening in your head? How were you writing it? How were you thinking?
I was drawing a lot from the subcultures of Bombay, especially the subculture of Bhaigiri. There's a sort of undercurrent of the underworld. In fact, it's funny. I have to share this very bizarre anecdote. On the way here, one of these days, one of the drivers of the car asked me, "Where are you from?" So I said Bombay. So I was expecting he say, "Oh, Bombay, Sachin Tendulkar." So instead of going, he goes, "Oh, Bombay, Dawood Ibrahim." So I was like, yeah, that's the one. but anyways, so there has always been a interesting undercurrent of organized crime in the history of Bombay. It's very important. It's undeniable almost, and it's quite visible. There's a latent energy on some of the streets where you feel that sort of the last vestiges of that. Although organized crime doesn't really exist in today's day and age to the extent that it did in the 90s, compared to, the kind of power that they wielded at that point, they've been pretty defanged in today's day and age, right? So but some of the vestiges of that culture still remained in the area where I grew up. The way people would talk, the vernacular, the sort of the dialect, and the sort of subculture in general, and that was an essential component of my first novel. I really wanted to write a Bombaya crime novel. That was a very important sort of agenda on my part, that I wanted to write a crime novel that quintessentially captured some of the subcultures that I had grown up with and observed and that I found interesting. And so what she was saying was very interesting about observing how Agatha Christie, breaking it down and just examining the clockwork aspect of it, because she was the master of plots, right? She was the greatest plot creator. But tell me something, I have a question. So most often some thriller writers, they prefer to, or crime writers or suspense writers, they prefer to write the last chapter first and then work their way backwards. Do you prefer to usually have a solution up front and then work your way through it, or do you yourself not like to know where the story or the investigation is going to go?
Okay, this is going to sound really lame, but the characters told me. There were three directions in which, I don't want to give away the ending, but the endings were basically violent, really violent, and terribly violent. And I left that choice in the hand of the characters, because what happens with Delhi, I was listening to you about Bombay and thinking Delhi's vibe is disorganized crime,
Oh, interesting.
There are gangs that are kept in check, basically because they're useful to various political parties. But the classic Delhi question, I've been in a love-hate relationship with this city for more than 30 years. I moved out to Goa briefly, moved out to the Himalayas, but I've never been able to leave. There's so much life on the streets and on the outskirts of it. One of the minor characters in Black River, for example, is a guy called the Tinsel King. And, he presents in this shimmering costume out in the middle of an island, and he's clearly insane. And behind him was my secret weapon, which is my mother's a lawyer, and for a brief while she was a criminal lawyer. And when I was whining at her about a story, she would make me read her law cases. So I picked up this sense of Delhi as a city where in one part of it, that's where the poisoners hang out. For some reason, the traditional part of Delhi prefers to kill people through poisoning. And in another part of the city, you have the guys who pick up kattas, country-made pistols from across Haryana, and either kill their victim or themselves, or sometimes with great economy, put paid to both at the same time. And a lot of the writing of this was actually just, I suspect, what Vivaan's done himself. A lot of it happened on my feet. You're walking the city, and you're sitting around with people whom you otherwise wouldn't meet, whether they're policemen. I spent a lot of time, this is the more serious part of things, but I spent a lot of time on the gender beat for the New York Times. And at some point I felt burdened by the number of deaths I was seeing, the number of what somebody told me was an ordinary murder. You know, murders that would never pick up media space, never get into the newspapers, and almost always they were of young girls, very young girls, or women who were just about, trying to push past the barriers of being at home. And their families were left to mourn for years afterwards, were left to carry that weight of grief around. One of the people I met on the trail was this very calm man who used to walk into police stations and help out similar bereaved families. He'd never been able to find justice for his daughter. She'd been killed brutally, her body had been found in a well, and because the perpetrators were so much more powerful, they wouldn't even register a case. So this had become his life, and he was a sweet, cheerful man. At some point, somebody said, "You're carrying your grief around all these years, it must be such a burden." He said, "If I put down the grief, then where does the love go?" And 3 years later, one of the main characters came to me with the same question. So a lot of this, I think for us, you're trying to keep the pace fast and furious, and that's dictated by the urgency of what happens. A crime shatters everything around it, and it shatters a community. It challenges people to ask themselves a simple question: are you going to look away? Or are you actually going to try to struggle through some discomfort to try and solve it? The majority of the cases that I came across in Delhi, Uttar Pradesh and Haryana, it was so easy to look away. And I developed a kind of fondness for the few policemen or the few people in the justice system who refused to do that, who said that that's too easy.
Who go after it, relentlessly. And it's very interesting you mentioned what that old man said, if I put my love down, where does my grief go? He obviously didn't say it in English, he said it in Hindi, right? And that's my next question to both of you, right? Obviously your characters are not speaking in English, right? Your characters are speaking in Haryanvi, your characters are speaking in Bombay, right? So then, but you're writing in English. Yes. How does that happen? How do you kind of reproduce the nuances or the funny things about Bambaya or the way the Haryanvi Hindi is spoken and so on? How do you kind of put them into English? What is that? You think about it in Hindi or Bambaya and then translate it, or how does that work? It can't be easy.
That's such an amazing question. You want to go first?
No, you go first.
Up to you. That's a brilliant question. I really want to know what you think.
I think I only calmed down about this. It's one of the reasons why Black River took so long. It took about 6 years and 5 drafts or whatever. The first draft was terrible. It was really awful. And it was awful because I was translating directly, from what people said. And then when you spend a lot of time, not just in your own head, sitting there writing beautiful sentences or not so beautiful sentences, but you spend a lot of time with your characters in the same way that you do with friends or, with someone you meet at a festival. And you're trying to understand where they come from. At some point, what Chand said is, I come from Haryana. My Hindi is pretty rural. It's comfortable with Delhi Hindi, but he came up with this line that's in the book. He said, when I go into Delhi, I have to put it on like a formal jacket and then take it off when I go back home. And Rabia and Khalid, originally Bengali speakers, come from a little village in Bengal and migrated out for economic reasons. So anyway, they're newcomers to the city and their Hindi is like that. Ombir and Bhimsen, the policemen, they speak hardcore Hindi. I just got comfortable with the idea that English was the one place where all of this could meet. And instead of translating, I tried, failed many, many times. And then I said, don't caricature, because they are thinking in whatever language. The English is just a vehicle, and I kept the Hindi and the Bengali behind the English. I hope it's worked. My editors caught 1 or 2 places where, you oversimplify English. And when you do that, you're not paying attention to how people actually are. So Ombir, his sessions are all very staccato. There's a beat to it like this. And I had nothing to do with that. That's the way he sees the world. He goes through it scene by scene. Everything that's happening is like that. Chand, he flows like that. He's a man of the earth. And so when you just let that language be, and you don't try to do too much to it, hopefully you've done it some justice. Sorry, that's long. And
It was very
but it's something I wanted to ask
insightful.
Vivaan, because when I started reading his books, I went into that unself-consciously, and in my mind, what I was hearing in English was Bombaya Hindi.
Yeah, absolutely.
How did you do that?
That was the intention, and also because I've always believed that there's two schools of literature. One which belongs to the slightly classical style of composition, of use of the English language, and the other which explores the slightly more vernacular, colloquial aspect, the various colloquial variants of English or Hindi. Or so, in the classic tradition of crime fiction, from Chandler onwards, there's always been this very specific tenor to the prose, which is almost, you could call it casual, informal, you could call it conversational, but not quite. But there is a certain, they're not writing in the Queen's English. There's certain contractions and certain usages of slang which kind of make it very close to the street. They make it streetwise in a sort. So I was using that same idiom and applying it to Bombaya Hindi. Because, and here and there putting in a word of Bombaya Hindi with the translation in the brackets in italics. And that was a very interesting aspect of that, is that how to communicate the sort of cadences and speech patterns of Bombaya Hindi in English, almost as if they were like subtitled, but not quite. But more than subtitles, I would say they were translations of the spirit of that slang and of that lingo. And there's a certain lexicon of criminal slang which just exists in crime fiction. They're almost like archetypes, right? Like the word rat. Although in Bombay Hindi, no one's going to say, "Arey, you're a rat." They have different words for that. But when you write, this person is a rat, he's a stool pigeon, there's a certain archetype which is formed in the head that you know what that person is referring to, even though that's not the word that character would actually use in real life. So those kinds of little liberties.
No, personally, I thought when I was reading your book, police informer sounds so boring. Khabri sounds
Sounds interesting, yeah.
so much better, doesn't it? So, I mean, letting few of those words stay, I think perhaps was a good thing. Most of us can kind of make out what's a khabri, what does it mean, and so on. And I'm glad you did that. You let khabri be. Though you, of course, said, he's police informer, etc. But the word stayed, the description stayed. And that's my next question to both of you, in a sense. I'm going to start with you, Vivaan. Your Bombay book has characters like Nadeem and, wonderfully American-sounding character like Warren, right?
Yeah, no, he's a Christian. He's a
of course.
Bombay Mac.
Yeah, and whereas your book has characters like Ombir and Ranbir, and almost seems like two different countries in a way. Clearly the Bombay thriller is kind of different from the Delhi thriller. Do you think so?
Because of the sort of the anthropological aspect of it, it would be different. But I guess in spirit there would be a similarity, right? But the anthropology of Delhi and Bombay is the streets of Delhi and Bombay are so different in a way, right? The mean streets of both those two respective cities, they have their own energy and their own sort of world. And but the nomenclature is a very essential part of writing. I feel that's one of the great joys of it, making up crazy names and stuff like that. Always a lot of my favorite writers also, they have very elaborate and interesting names for their characters. So that's always been one of the great joys, is the making up of names of various characters and how they sort of suit those certain personalities. That's been a very important part.
I'm going to bring in the Bangalore thriller as well, because I'm a huge fan of Anita Nair's Inspector Gowda series. And I look at all of our thrillers, Delhi noir fiction, Bombay thriller, Anita's detective fiction, as rogue cousins and the same family.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So there is that family resemblance. There's something about the Indian where this is going. It's becoming a very exciting genre, actually. You have the Panjana Pal as well from Bombay. You've got Sujata Massey doing historical thrillers, Tanuj Solanki. And all of us seem to be very comfortable slipping into English. Character-wise, yes, there is a difference. Bombay, it's got the organized crime, but again, Vivaan goes beyond that as well. And he was saying that his next book's also going to be a bit of a departure. Delhi is a city that has both, those centuries of history behind its back, the understanding that the city is permanently on the brink of disaster of some kind or the other. There's always a tyrant. There is always, an oppressive regime, or the city is crumbling or being sacked or besieged. And somewhere in our bones, we know that it will rise from the ashes and keep remaking itself. But for me, for the book that's not a sequel to Black River, but the companion that's coming up soon, what I was looking at is it's a city that both expanded really fast and got wealthy, or made some people wealthy and left a lot of people behind equally fast. What would have been compressed into something like 3 centuries for Bombay or Calcutta or large parts of Hyderabad, Bangalore. In Delhi, it just went boom in something like 3 to 5 decades. And that's caused its own stresses, there's an insecurity in a sense around all the wealth and power that people have. And that makes them edgy. They never know whether they're going to be swamped by the gang lords from Uttar Pradesh or the property builders who are eyeing Delhi land from Haryana. And there's political power, there's land power, and there's just money, money in a way that is extremely and beautifully corrupting. So that's where.
So we are used to seeing policemen, Indian policemen in a certain way, largely inspired by cinema, right? And this is cinema across languages, whether Bollywood or regional cinema. Either the policeman is corrupt, or he's a vigilante who is going to set right the world by beating up everybody and shooting everybody, right? So that's the black and white characterization of policemen usually, at least in popular films. I'm not talking about art films here. But both of you have, drawn portraits of very realistic policemen. They are not totally corrupt. In fact, in your book, Nilanjana, they are actually not corrupt at all. At least that's the sense of it.
The Harley Davidson. There's
of course.
The acceptance of things that they should not accept.
So, and in yours as well, they are more realistic. So are they based on policemen the policemen you have shadowed or, spoken to? Where do these policemen come from? Clearly they're not Bollywood or regional language badass policemen at all.
I have a feeling Vivaan hung out in a lot of permit bars with a lot of cops to do this. That
would have been fun, or was it?
No, yes, I've interacted with a lot of policemen over the course of my life, and had a few run-ins with the law. But the Bombay Police is a very, very fascinating organization. I mean, it's a very distinct police force. It's got its own sort of cultural identity, in a sense. It's almost, there's a sort of place for the Bombay cops in pop culture thanks to the movies. But I really wanted to stray away from the cliche of the Maharashtrian policeman, which Bollywood has perpetrated a lot. Right. And even up till very recently in realistic films, and they get the cops wrong, I feel, often. They just don't get even the nomenclature they use for the policemen are very high. They sort of really... They pick the most cliched Maharashtrian sounding names imaginable. They'll be like this thing so many times that's not like, which is why I especially wanted to stray away from that, and I called my cop Inspector Praveen Nagpal as opposed to Gawande or something, usual in very that sense. Very Marathi typical. Sounding. The way Bollywood really sort of emphasizes that aspect and picks the most cliched Maharashtrian sounding names that they know of.
Occasionally there'll be this throwaway line in Marathi
exactly.
to establish the
authenticity of that. Exactly. I definitely wanted to stray away from that because I think every Bombay Vasi has a very complicated and interesting relationship with the Bombay police. They're a very fascinating... They're very interesting. But the Delhi police is brutal on the other hand. They are a whole different ball game, right? I mean, there's a different sort of intensity to the Delhi police I've noticed. The Bombay police is also, I mean, it's complicated, but it's still, I find that often, especially RTO cops and whatnot on the day-to-day basis, if you talk to them sweetly, they're by and large pretty sweet. But when they have to be intense, they have to be rough, they have to be... But the Delhi police, I've noticed, is a whole different animal, right?
The Delhi police are pussycats compared to the Uttar Pradesh police.
Oh, yeah. Correct.
It's
actually going to
real
Noida.
Badass.
Yeah, when you go to Noida only, you feel the difference.
Yeah, but it's a straight deal. The police is basically an arm of the state.
Yeah.
So I was writing this book around 2015 and it moved into 2016-17. At that point of time, you still had the echoes of the old police force that Ribeiro and company had set up. which was basically geared to recognizing power inside the city. If you have a VIP number plate, they'll be wonderful. Yeah, the police are your best friend then. And if you're nobody from nowhere, the police, it's in the background a little bit, but in Black River, one of the things that the migrants just adjust to is the number of demolition drives, you know, and that's what the police have been put in charge of, you know, kind of clearing out the debris, clearing out whoever you don't want. And what's happening with Ombir, I think it's going to happen a lot more in the second book when he encounters Delhi policemen, is Delhi corrupts everything, and it's been doing that for centuries since the Mughal courts, when the Jats were around. It's basically, okay, you don't like us, you want to be a crusader in the city, come baby, we will feed you some nice dinners and get you onto our side. You know, we never say that we are suborning you, but we'll make your life in the city very comfortable so long as you play the game. Okay? And on the other hand, I was meeting rural policemen who are very bound by caste and religious identity. So part of Black River is also about Hindu-Muslim tensions.
Yes.
And you know, among the policemen, one of them looks at a placard that said Muslims not allowed in the village after there's a Muslim suspect in a certain crime. And he's like, oh, okay, this is what we should be doing, you know, we're keeping the community safe. And the other one is like, no, you know, don't do this. But his reason is, don't do this because the media will pick up on it and stereotype us. But Delhi is the original walled city. And your experience with the police depends on whether you're on the good side of the wall or not.
Yes.
You were mentioning something very interesting when we were chatting earlier, that the policeman often feels misunderstood, right? He feels he's not being given his due. And you mentioned that, you know, often the policeman turns philosophical. You know, you use the phrase, the policeman philosopher, right? Tell us a little more about that. I'm very intrigued by the kind of policeman philosophers you've met.
Okay, very briefly, I was wandering around a lot of very small villages and small townships in Haryana and Uttar Pradesh around 2009 to 2013 or so. And after a while, you know, you're going into areas where the policemen themselves will tell you, sister, after 5 p.m., please go back to the city because after 5 p.m. is when criminals are investigated. Let me put it that way. And when politicians drop in at the police station and the real dhanda and the real business starts off. And it's not safe. But before that, when you see the quarters that we make the police live in, the police came in last on the list. I'm going to go off into a little bit of administration stuff. But years back when the country became independent and the quarters were handed out, the IAS, the IFS and the IRS grabbed the best. And police have traditionally lived in conditions where it would make you weep to see them. It more or less makes it clear, I'm not making an excuse for their venality, it makes it clear that corruption is going to be part of the system because you're living in crumbled police stations and stuff. And every policeman out there, either you met the really vicious kinds, and I was scared of those guys and stayed away from them, people who found an outlet, a permission to be really, really violent. And their reaction to you, if you were in the media, was first intimidation. You know we can just throw you and lock up. You can disappear, your body will be found in the canal. That was by way of an introduction. After that, you'd get around to saying, I heard over stuff. But there were a lot of policemen who just saw themselves in the old school way as darogas, as people whose job was the beat constable was the person I still remain a little bit in love with. Yeah. Because you know, they saw it as their business to know how the community was, if people were doing okay. Their relationships with the places that were in were very solid. And you ask them a simple question like, is the crime rate higher for rape and abduction this year? Or is the reporting higher and is that a good thing? And they would say, you know, the times are terrible. People are being corrupted because no longer are they watching the Ramayana and the Mahabharata on television. Instead, they are watching things that put very bad thoughts into the heads of our very good boys. I'm telling you, those boys are quite sweet. But what to do? We are living through Kali Yuga. Do you know this is the last few years of Kali Yuga? And suddenly, you know, the conversation would have gone 180 degrees into deep Hindu philosophy or whatever it was. Or you have policemen who come and quote Gandhi to you. and then are interrupted because they have to go off and beat up a suspect, but presumably in a gentle, Gandhian, peaceful way. But a lot of them were, guys who had moved into the police with a little bit of education and a lot of listening to oral stories, folklore, and all of that. So streams of that would come out at you. And I saw, in a sense, a missed opportunity, for that kind of policeman to, policing to take root. The policeman as the carer of the community. That doesn't happen so much.
So are there poet philosophers or policeman philosophers in Bombay?
Yes,
or are they all Hindi film lyricists?
No. They're not. They're police. Absolutely, the way she was describing it, I've had similar conversations with cops as well. Absolutely, where they've started getting very sort of ruminative and senti and almost meditative, where they really start talking about the nature of life. As you said, Kali Yuga is something I've heard them mention, and that sort of thing. And there's certainly a philosophical streak to a policeman's day-to-day life, because it's a very difficult job, and it's also a lonely job. And there is a sense of, there's the classic trope of where, in crime fiction itself, where like there's a car going in the highway with a dead body in the trunk, and a highway patrol police officer stops them, and they're trying to get through the checking of the license and registration, and the fugitives are ready to go, and the cop just wants to keep talking because he just doesn't have anyone to have conversation with, and he keeps talking, and that's what is their undoing. It's because of that guy's loneliness that he ends up busting them with the dead body in the trunk. That's like a classic trope of crime fiction.
Vivaan, that's so cute. All of them are in trouble with their family lives, yeah?
Yeah.
Either their wives are complaining of being neglected, or somebody has got tired of being neglected and found comfort elsewhere. Or a lot of the younger policemen, again, are in deep frustration because they haven't got married. And here I sound like I care about the police. They are terrifying when they are forged into a force and given the full extent of the powers that we've been granting them from British colonial times.
Full extent of the powers and some more,
And
outside.
some more. One of the biggest things, I touched on this very lightly in Black River, and you must have as well, but policemen are also the greatest, they're better fiction writers than we are. They write this thing called a diary, which is supposed to keep an hour-to-hour track of what goes on in the police force.
And like a log.
Yeah. And usually it's the junior-most guy out there who basically takes dictation from what the police feel their day should look like, not how the day actually went.
I wonder what they write about when they beat up suspects. How does that go into the diary or into the logbook? What do they write? Questioning, something like that.
I asked about that. Question the suspect in the presence of witnesses for 2 hours. Suspect was non-committal for the first hour and then sang like a canary in the second hour. Versions.
But I think the gist of what we're talking about also is interesting, because although we must recognize the sort of the unethical nature of a lot of police behavior, but I yet feel it's important to humanize them.
Yes.
Right, rather than treat them as villains in crime fiction. I think and everybody, as you said, like there's a fondness for the beat constable, which I also share, absolutely. And so it's a double-edged kind of thing, where it's a fine balance of trying to show the reality of what a policeman's life and work could be like, but also granting a measure of empathy and compassion.
I love it that you said, you spoke about writing with empathy, because when you stereotype when you don't know, right? And when you get to see policemen, I saw a lot of fatigue by and large, and I saw in the middle of that fatigue and tiredness and the daily grind and the relentless pressure that they're under increasingly from politicians to do their bidding or the media to do their bidding, somewhere in there's the seeds, not quite of goodness, but there's the seeds of wanting to uphold that oath they swore ages back. It still runs in the blood for some of them. Many of them are very proud to be policemen again. But some in private and private only will tell you in anguish that they hate what policing has come to, that this is not what it's supposed to be about. So
they're powerless to change it, in fact.
Can't change it.
And that powerlessness makes them probably more violent and more, brutal in some ways.
Sometimes, but it can actually bring out the good in a few people. In this time, I think it's every service is pretty much every armed service is pretty much being put to the test.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
I'm going to ask you both for book recommendations. right? An old thriller that you love and something recent that you've liked, maybe a couple of them just for the audience to kind of binge on.
One of my favorite crime novels of all time is The Getaway by Jim Thompson, which is a really mind-blowing book. It's a great heist novel also, and it almost goes into a surreal kind of place towards the end of it, and so many. I mean, actually, it's interesting how the history of crime fiction is almost two-part. There's the British parlor room school of Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers, G.K. Chesterton, and John Dickinson Carr, who's actually American but wrote in a very British kind of style. The sleuth, the whole business of the sleuth. And then on the other hand, the post-war American private eye, which is a whole different kind of creature, who is more of a streetwise, almost like a stray dog in a sense. He wasn't an aristocratic figure like Poirot or like Miss Marple. He wasn't someone who belonged to the more genteel strata. Yeah. So he's a gumshoe, exactly. So there's two great traditions of that kind of thing. But I would say Jim Thompson is one of my favorites. David Goodis, Edgar Allan Poe is, I think, one of the architects of the genre, because his Murders in the Rue Morgue inspired Conan Doyle to create Sherlock Holmes. That was a very defining story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, and so amongst Ankush Saikia is very interesting. You all must check out Ankush Saikia's works. He has a detective called Arjun Arora, and he also explores the underbelly of Delhi in a very interesting way. He also explores the underbelly of Delhi. But there's so many crime fiction is just such a vast treasure trove of different styles and writers. There's just too
but
much.
Something that's still not been given its due in a literary sense. In the popular sense, I think they've been very, very popular. But I think I don't, like you said, Hindi Sahitya Academy just being very dismissive about Surendra Mohan Pathak and so on. I think it was a little unfair. But any recommendations from you in old new crime writing?
There's so much, but I'm partial to a classic, Patricia Highsmith, The Talented Mr. Ripley. We were just talking about that. And such a gorgeous examination of somebody who's amoral and comfortable with that. And she's my go-to for noir fiction that makes you uncomfortable, but where you're willing to live with that discomfort in order to keep reading. And underrated, a whole bunch of Japanese authors. We hear a lot justly about Scandinavian writers and about the Scottish school. I'm a huge fan of Val McDermid, Tana French. What they do is they're writing about crime, but they're also writing about communities, some of them in isolation, some of them not in glitzy, the grittier part of the cities of Edinburgh, Glasgow, whatever it is. And they really captured, these are city novels for me as well, these are place novels. But I loved Keigo Higashino, who The Devotion of Suspect X, and if you haven't read that,
that's fantastic.
You must come to his works. And again, I'm trying to remember the names, but Natsuo Kirino, the Japanese writer who does detective fiction as well. A lot of the young women writers in Japan, again, are beginning to break the genre opener, So I've been looking in, I tend to look offside a little bit. The classics, of course, there's so many of them. I'm still partial to Byomkesh Bakshi. That's being a little parochial, but I love reading him because he combines historical with these outlandish crimes. His murderer is not an ordinary murderer. He will not pick up a paperweight lying on the table and do you in. He will find the quill of a porcupine, which is a rare species, sitting in some collector's thing and, commit his crime that way.
One last question, and this is about films, right? Did you like Sushant Rajput's portrayal of Byomkesh Bakshi, striding like that with his dhoti? Did you enjoy that, since you're such a fan?
Let me be really tactful about this and say that I love the Bengali versions of Byomkesh Bakshi.
The one with Rajit Kapoor. Yeah. The Rajit Kapoor,
those were in Hindi and Dootashan.
Sorry. Those are the Hindi one. Yeah, the Bengali one was with...
Again, I'm just forgetting the name of the
actor.
Wasn't
Soumitra Chatterjee, was it?
No,
it wasn't.
No. Yeah. It was one of the modern generation. He's very famous, but I'm messing up on the name.
Okay, no, I know who you're talking about. Yeah, I'm forgetting his name. One more person that I'd like to recommend. He's a very obscure. This is a very deep cut. Damon Runyon. But also Damon Runyon is slightly more comedic. It's less, not as intense and disturbing as Jim Thompson and these guys. Damon Runyon is very fun, and I got you were talking about the monikers. So especially the Bombay underworld and my street corner sort of landscape has a lot of that. So which my characters had names like Nadeem Chipkali, Irshad Batla, Naved Patla, Lamba Adnan. These kind of that's the classic moniker that which Damon Runyon had. Like he had Ice Pick Hamilton.
Chikna.
Yeah, exactly. So Damon Runyon, and also this other person by the name of W.R. Burnett, who wrote you've heard of him? He's very so all those Warner Brothers gangster films of the 30s with Bogart and all, they were all the source material of theirs was W.R. Burnett. So everything from Little Caesar to High Sierra, he created the figure of the sympathetic outlaw, where it was because they were also coming out of the Depression, so they had a very different relationship with law enforcement, and the outlaw itself was a sort of Robin Hood figure who was doing right. So that he W.R. Burnett is someone who explored that sort of aspect of crime fiction.
You haven't mentioned him yet, but there's this writer who really knows his way around the genre, and he writes these racy thrillers with a lot of depth called Vivaan Shah, and you really should pick up his books.
Yes, absolutely. Highly recommended. And Nilanjana's book as well. Can you hold it up just for a second? Vivan's book, I'm sorry, didn't come. But Vivan has two lovely books, Living Hell and another one, Highway. I'm blanking out on the other name. Midnight Freeway, sorry. So both of them excellent books. I'm almost through Living Hell. I really enjoyed it. And I'm almost through Black River, part of my preparation for... I still don't know the ending. And I was hoping you wouldn't give it away. I'm really looking forward to tonight.